Segal. And we ready? Okay, let's start.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm very grateful to be able to participate in this conference from my home here in Nevada City. I would love to have been there with all of you. But, you know, technology has a shadow side, but in this case, time and space with you. So the title of this presentation is called Uncovering the Unconscious Toward an Integral Psychology. And you might say, I'm just trying to imagine in a kind of open-ended way, what would happen if an anthroposophist, an analytical psychologist, and a cultural phenomenologist walked into a bar and had a conversation with one another about the perils and promise of our moment. So this is an open-ended project. I very much look forward to discussing some of the connections that I draw during the Q&A. So, as all Jungians will know, the movements of the soul tend to manifest in polarities. As Jung himself says, all the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They must be so, for they express the necessary polarity inherent in every self-regulating system. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. So the most obvious such polarity for a living being, I would suggest, is that between birth and death. To be born is already to be dying. In a fractal-like way, we experience this paradox of death in miniature each day, in the cycle of waking and sleeping. The quality of our waking consciousness depends upon how well we have slept the night before. So too does it depend on how well we have integrated the looming inevitability of death. Balancing these and other polarities is essential to the health of the rational ego, which must sink into dreams and darkness each evening in order to rise. The soul's mysteries are ungraspable by the intellect alone. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Of course, neuroscientific inquiry has suggested that sleep and dreams may serve certain important functions in the brain, and while the veil of death may be impenetrable from within the horizon of our personal consciousness, biology has revealed its crucial role in the evolution of species. Still, it must be conceded that the strange facts of sleep and death conceal greater secrets than the scientific method alone can unveil. The nature of the psyche is largely hidden from the bright light of reason, and in its errant search for a mechanical explanation of its own existence, the rational ego finds many of its own projections reflected back to it. The hypothesis of the unconscious, writes Jung, puts a large question mark after the idea of the psyche. Philosophers had for many centuries assumed that the structure and function of the soul was already known in every detail. But as the 19th century came to a close, the burgeoning discipline of psychology began to reveal a far more complex and even irrational subterranean source of conscious processes. Rather than working with the static and compartmentalized model of the soul, constructed by scholastic thinkers, Jung was forced, both by his personal descent into the depths as well as by his experience as a clinician, to develop a dynamic, living relationship with these psychic processes. As his practice matured, Jung came to realize that the soul is not merely a scientific object. In the first place, every science, Jung says, is a function of the psyche, and all knowledge is rooted in it. But how is psychology, the science of the soul, to proceed if its foundational hypothesis admits the existence of an unconscious that by definition remains largely inaccessible to the rational ego? The cultural phenomenologist phenomenologist Jean Gebser recognized this difficulty, and though he had the highest respect for Jung's groundbreaking work, he nonetheless called into question the concept of the unconscious. There is no so-called unconscious, Gebser writes. There are only various modalities or intensities of consciousness. A one-dimensional magical, a two-dimensional mythical, a three-dimensional mental consciousness, and there will also be an integral four-dimensional consciousness of the whole. Gebser suggests that the concept of the unconscious may still be useful in describing the relationship between structures of consciousness. We might say that the mental is unconscious of the magic and the mythic, and so on. But he was opposed to the idea of a generalized unconscious. Jung himself, of course, rarely, if ever, collapsed the psychic terrain into so neat a dichotomy. But Gebser's differentiated phenomenology of consciousness, in terms of a potentially ever-present and yet also historically unfolding series of structures, assures that such a simplified reduction is avoided. In light of Gebser's important critique of the notion of the unconscious, Jung's work is interpreted in what follows as the tentative beginning of an integral psychology. Both Gebser and the founder of philosophy, Rudolf Steiner, provide important additions and amendments to Jung's psychology, assuring that we avoid the undue reduction of spiritual realities to psychic projections. Using Gebser's terms, the purpose of an integral psychology, I argue, is to enter into conscious dialogue with the archetypal energies of the soul, reconnecting with its mythic powers of synchronicity and its mythic symbols of polarity, so as to heal the dualistic split that our mental rational civilization has hewn between cosmic and human intelligences. Jung's practice of active imagination, as artfully displayed in the Red Book, will provide a working example of how this dialogue can be initiated and sustained. My aim is to creatively integrate each figure's, Jung, Gebser, and Steiner's most important insights in the hopes of inspiring a new approach to psychology that acknowledges spiritual realities and avoids privileging the intellect in a one-sided way. Gebser wrote that in the analytic psychology of C.G. Jung, we can discern a manifest attempt to overcome the psychic dualism that is the terminological heritage of Freud's materialistic psychoanalysis. Gebser points specifically to Jung's theory of individuation as the most promising move in this direction. The archetype of the self is, for Jung, both the center and the circumference of the psyche. It encompasses all opposites, not by submerging them back into undifferentiated unconsciousness, but by luring the psyche toward a more complex form of wholeness, wherein eventually maximum interior differentiation or individuality is achieved alongside maximum exterior harmony. Whereas for Freud, and this is a diagram that Freud himself included in one of his books, whereas for Freud, the desire for psychic wholeness is nothing but a regressive infantile longing to return to our mother's womb, for Jung it represents our human need to simultaneously discover our cosmic extent and penetrate to our spiritual essence. So in this section, I want to speculate upon how the complex wholeness of the incarnating self resituates the dualistic partiality of egoic consciousness. These speculations concerning the emergence of the self rest upon the premise that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, or that the individual in some sense contains and relives the collective history of the species. This is a hypothesis that I believe Jung, Gebser, and Steiner all share. They also agree that while the evolution of consciousness is collective, the real action takes place as a result of individual transformation. Now, I know Gebser problematizes this term evolution. It doesn't mean simply progression. Every evolutionary mutation is as much a step forward as a step back, and much of progression is a regression. So I mean evolution in a more general sense than that which a simply progressive understanding of it that Gebser critiques. So Steiner writes, unconscious, we have to find the most essential transitional forces for the whole of humankind, just as we must find in the individual the most important forces for the development of a fully awake consciousness. Recognition of this mutual interplay between the individual and the collective must be at the heart of any deep inquiry into the psyche. The psychologist must take great care not to neglect the power of the one in favor of the many, nor vice versa, since in the first place, any especially insightful individual's attempt to reveal what for most remains occult or hidden depends upon successfully speaking in a tongue that the ears of the spirit of the times are capable of hearing. The confrontation with the unconscious that led Jung to produce the Red Book at first drew him into solitude, and though he knew there was no way to rationally justify the gnosis imparted to him by the spirit of the depths, he was compelled nonetheless to communicate its symbolic meanings to others. Individuation, though individual, is never simply an inner process, but is bound up with the transformation of other people and of the world itself. The spirit of the depths in me, wrote Jung, is at the same time the ruler of the depths of world affairs. Gebser's approach to the evolution of consciousness, or in Jung's terms, the incarnation of the self, rests upon the phenomenological observation that in the course of human history, clearly, in Gebser's terms, quote, clearly discernible worlds stand out whose development or unfolding took place in mutations of consciousness. These world structures, which, as we know, Gebser classifies into archaic, magic, mythic, and mental, each with its respective spatio-temporal character, these structures remain present and active even for our contemporary deficient form of mental rational consciousness. Humanity has not overcome each structure as if climbing a ladder, leaving lower rungs behind. Instead, our path has been one of dimensional intensification, whereby each increase in dimensionality depends upon the structural integrity of the prior layers. Of the collapse of the deficient mental rational structure, and the emergence of an integral aperspectival structure is congruent with Jung's ego-shattering encounter, as recounted in the Red Book, with what he called the new God, being conceived and born out of the human soul. Prior to composing the Red Book, Jung had achieved the heights of professional acclaim. By 1910, at age 35, he had received an honorary degree from Clark University. He had been elected the president of an international psychoanalytic association, and many other honors. The new scientific understanding of the psyche that Jung was at the forefront of securing gave no outward indication of the as yet unconscious turmoil soon to be unleashed upon the world. In 1913, Jung received his first hint of this turmoil in a waking vision of what he called a terrible flood that covered all of Europe, with, in Jung's words, yellow waves, swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands. The visions continued to trouble Jung into 1914, producing a great inner uncertainty. He began to fear he was on his way to, in his terms, doing a schizophrenia, and in April he resigned his position as president of the International Psychoanalytical Association and as lecturer at the University of Zurich. More dreams of catastrophe haunted him until finally, on August 1st, 1914, war broke out in Europe, paradoxically relieving Jung from the worst of his fears. Jung said, "Now I was sure that no schizophrenia was threatening me. I understood that my dreams and my visions came to me from the subsoul of the collective unconscious." Jung's personal visionary experiences during this period mirrored the collective European psyche's descent into. Gebser, writing several decades later, marks the early 20th century as the climax of the mutation from the alienated, rationalistic ego of the deficient mental structure of consciousness to the holistic and re-enchanted consciousness of the integral structure. This mutational process is still underway today, and though signs of integration can be found, nothing guarantees the success of such an epical transformation. In the Red Book, Jung artfully exemplifies for collective view the imaginal process of soul-making that can remind the would-be autonomous perspectival ego of its origin in a shared substratum of myth and magic. Jung's practice of active imagination can aid the transformation out of the closed three-dimensional world of mental rational consciousness, giving rise to the conditions necessary for a second birth, not of the water, but of the spirit. The shortcoming of modern psychoanalytic theory, Jung realized, was certainly not its verification of a psychic totality deeper than egoic consciousness, but its objectifying and epistemologically skeptical method of inquiry into the nature of this totality. Modern psychology had reduced the soul to a scientific object. A basic lack of openness to the spiritual implications of the meaning-making capacity of the soul inevitably led to the reductive explanation of its living archetypal dynamics in terms of impersonal mechanistic forces. As Jung said, as he writes in the Red Book, I had to accept that what I had previously called my soul was not at all my soul, but a dead system. Gebser, too, goes to great lengths in the ever-present origin mental or perspectival form of consciousness, unable to divorce itself from an exclusively three-dimensional spatial framework. As Gebser writes, we of the European Atlantic cultural community have as of yet been unable to make the leap at the crucial moment from the three-dimensional world of our fathers into the fourth-dimensional reality of our day. As long as we fail to make this leap, crisis, uncertainty, and anxiety will continue to prevail, and they can destroy us in the short run unless we realize the new world reality. For Gebser, the illuminative potential of pure consciousness is, in his words, definitely not restricted to spatialization and temporalization. But trapped in the three-dimensionality of the mental rational structure, consciousness becomes spatially frozen, unable to conceive of time, the fourth dimension, in terms other than that of partition and division, that is, of quantity. Time loses the qualitative texture of its flow and its transparency to the wholeness of eternity, becoming the flattened clock time of mechanistic physics, wherein the simultaneity of spatial extension is thought to constitute all of reality. There is literally no room for the soul and its mythos in the spatial world of the hyper-rational ego. And so, the soul is pushed back into pre-perspectival subconsciousness, there generating, through compensation, the collective afflictions of techno-industrial society. Gebser writes, if the world is regarded only through wakefulness, it loses its undivided, dreamlike, and somnolent aspects and precipitates their separation. The dividing deed leads to the death of man, of humanity, and of humanity's entire situation. Wakeful, egoic consciousness must come to terms with the deeper, undivided temporal polarity constituting its psychic totality if our civilization is to survive the mutational process already underway on our planet. The heroic modern ego has by now awakened to the bright light of noonday, but there its development has become arrested. The temporary vantage at the top of the world has blinded it to the compensatory shadow work that remains to be done. The ego must accept the necessity of descending below the horizon. If Jung, Gebser, and as we'll see, Steiner are right, the world itself hangs in the balance. The ego remains ignorant of the integral chiaroscuro that reveals the fourth dimensional hypersphere hiding in the shadows of all relative spatial horizons. Here, at the hearth of the world, light returns to shadow, night completes day, and the angel of death rounds each of our lives with a peaceful sleep. The ego must admit its dependence upon sleep, dreams, and death, which is also to say, its dependence upon the structural integrity of archaic, magic, and mythic consciousness. It must forego the hubristic desire to murder the self-existing being of the soul, by reducing it to the abstract concepts of learned scholarship. Integral, aperspectival, or individuated consciousness does not involve the dissolution of the ego and its directed mode of rational thought. It is important to note, but rather the integration of this mode with the imaginal and unitive modes of the mythic and magic structures. The rational ego has remade the world in its own image, constructing cities more suited for machines than in deadened environments that lack altogether the luminosity that encompassed earlier forms of consciousness. The stars themselves have retreated from view, the countenance of heaven veiled by the artificial glow of our electrified wonderland. The lack of integration of earlier modes of consciousness must not be mistaken for the lack of influence they still have over our daily lives. However, the power of magic and the meaning of myth may lack the diaphaneity provided by a fully individuated and integrated consciousness. But just because our deficient mental society is ignorant of their effects does not at all make these effects negligible. The task of bringing to awareness an integral, individuated mode of consciousness is not at all that of shedding more primitive ways of being and knowing. The Enlightenment Project, which aimed at the total rationalization of life, employed itself with precisely this task. The mere divinization of the ego and its imbalanced desire for complete control over nature and society has not eliminated the non-rational, but merely pushed the instincts of the magic and the archetypes of the mythic structures into subconsciousness, where they still fester in their deficient mode and find compensation through all the great social ills of our time. The meaning-making function of the pre-perspectival structures has been subverted by the anti-myths and the black magic inherent to the techno-scientific worldview. Not psychic wholeness and cultural resilience, but material power and political control now constitute our guiding ideals. The values and purposes of the larger Earth community have been negated by a Cartesian mechanistic science whose methods are predicated upon the evacuation of soul from nature. I think, functions as the epistemological foundation of modern rationality and our alienated way of life. It claims to be a purely logical derivation. I think, therefore I am, but it remains blind to its own mythic and imaginal origins, thus functioning as an anti-myth or a myth that represses its own mythic status. One could hardly ask for a better example of psychological splitting than that on display in Descartes' still intellectually brilliant text, Meditations on First Philosophy, which was published in 1639. In this text, after dismissing the philosophical import of imagination, which Descartes says is suspect because it is productive only of, in his terms, mere storytelling and mere dreams, Descartes then goes on to ask us, in the very next paragraph, to imagine that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has conjured the sky, the air, the earth, color, shapes, sounds, and all external things, that a demon has conjured these as fictions to deceive our intellect. So in other words, Descartes' most famous philosophical argument for the existence of the ego is itself an exercise in imagination. In addition to Descartes' repression of the mythic structure, modern civilization's obsession with economics provides another example of the repression of the magical structure. Economic progress has become the sole raison d'etre of Western civilization, a progress measured only in terms of the accumulation of monetary instruments. The unchallenged power of money, which now mediates almost every interpersonal encounter of our lives, is the result of a fetishization, the undue attribution of magical power or luminosity to facilitate exchange among human beings. Money has come to transform human beings into a means for achieving its own ends. Overcoming these collective ills, according to Jung, will require, I quote, bringing our original mind back to consciousness, where it has never been before, and where it has never undergone critical self-reflection. We have been that mind, but we have never known it. We got rid of it before understanding it. Reacquainting ourselves with the ever-present origin of consciousness is no simple matter, since individuation cannot be accomplished by mental reflection alone. In this next section, Jung's method of active imagination is explored and developed alongside Steiner's spiritual science, in the hopes that a possible way forward toward the integration of body, soul, and spirit might be uncovered. For Jung, the initial spontaneous eruption of psychic disturbances was more traumatic than constructive. In the year prior to the outbreak of war, Jung had been experiencing great doubt in his own professional motivations. In his autobiography, he recounts the anxiety he experienced at this time, around December 1913, in response to, quote, the fantasies which were stirring in me underground. Eventually, on December 12th, 1913, Jung built up the courage to, in his terms, let himself drop. Jung writes, suddenly it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into dark depths. I could not fend off a feeling of panic. But then, abruptly, at not too great a depth, I landed on my feet. In the depths of his solitude, Jung met himself. He writes, we are alone, and our being together threatens to become unbearable. Jung decides to educate himself, to teach himself a greater form of self-esteem, or else, he writes, our life together will become wretched. Jung then begins a dialogue and a dispute with his own mirror image, which, in typical ambiguous polar psychic fashion, is simultaneously his self or spirit and his shadow. This confrontation, Jung would later write, is the first test of courage on the inner way, sufficient to frighten off most people. It was only later that Jung developed the method that he called active imagination, which is a way of deliberately descending into the depths of the psyche. The point of imaginatively activating the unconscious in such a way is not merely to wonder at the play of images. Indeed, some contemporary Jungians even warn that carelessness in the practice of Jung's method may lead to psychopathology. Rather, active imagination should serve as the preparatory work necessary for achieving genuine spiritual inspiration along the way to individuation. According to Steiner, human beings long ago lost immediate contact with the spiritual world due to the emergence of the ego, which has redirected all of our attention to the physical body and the external sensory world. Our task today, says Steiner, is to consciously develop the imagination so as to transform it from a generator of fantasies into an organ of perception. Steiner writes, when our soul really attains to imagination, it senses in its life of visualizations something akin to what it feels in its life of perceptions. In the latter, the soul feels its direct contact with the outer world, with corporeality. In imagination, it feels an indirect contact with a world that at first also appears to it as an outer world. Steiner's mention of the outerness of the spiritual world disclosed by imagination is meant to emphasize the independent, though not separate, existence of this realm. Jung also suggests that the luminous images or archetypes encountered in such altered states of consciousness are autonomous living beings, not to be confused with mere projections or personal memories. They should be engaged with on their own terms as conscious entities no less real than our own ego. For Jung, individuation is all that can prevent human civilization from spiraling into the disorder and chaos of mass-mindedness. The change must begin with one individual, he writes. Jung continues, nobody can afford to look around and wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself, as nobody knows what he could do. He might be bold enough to ask himself whether by any chance his unconscious might know something helpful, when there is no satisfactory conscious answer anywhere in sight. Jung's method of active imagination, his way of gaining access to the deeper intelligence and transformative power, is his way of gaining access to the transformative power of the subterranean structures of the psyche. Like Steiner, Jung realized that modern human beings have become so captivated by the ego's ability to predict and control nature that, quote, to quote Jung, we have simply forgotten the age-old fact that God speaks chiefly through dreams and visions. It is not in the outer sensory world, at least as the ego imagines this world, but within our own hearts and minds that the deeper meaning and spiritual truth that we long for is to be discovered. Steiner, however, levels an important criticism upon those approaches to psychology that would limit the transformative reach of the archetypal being within the imaginatively activated soul. One is careful to guard against the intellect's tendency to dismiss or rationalize the intense emotions that luminous encounters produce. But as Steiner points out, and I quote, if the soul never emerged out of itself, but merely kept wanting to experience desires and emotions, anything from the deepest reverence to disgust, nothing would happen that is independent of the soul. For Steiner, the whole point of developing one's capacity for imaginative perception is to rise above the limiting subjectivity of the egocentric soul. Active imagination develops self-understanding, but the aim is not just to know oneself truly. It is also, in Steiner's view, to will what is good. All stirrings of conscience, according to Steiner, emerge in the liminal space between the subjective emotionality of the soul and the transpersonal intuition of the spirit. Though Jung generally limits himself to phenomenological descriptions of the psyche's manifestations in his more scientific writings, in the Red Book, perhaps because of the collective importance of its message, he goes beyond the appearances in an attempt to grasp the occult reality that they symbolize. In Scrutinies, a section of the Red Book, towards the end of the Red Book, Jung recounts his inner experience of hearing the call of conscience. The dialogue can be read in several ways, as a conversation between the self and the ego, between the spirit and the soul, or between the self and the shadow. What is clear is that Jung encounters a higher self, who is disgusted with the, quote, sensitivity and desirousness of his ego. What is concealed in you, says this higher self, I will drag out into the light. I will crush your superiority under my feet. This self continues, I will burn out of contents of which you were so proud, so that you will become empty like a poured out vessel. You should be a vessel of life, so kill your idols. The false idols the self demands be killed are Jung's sense of pride, self-righteousness, and ambition. The self chastises Jung's ego for putting his personal concerns above the whole of humanity. Quote, you are responsible to humanity in everything that you think, feel, and do, end quote. This experience represents the rising of the collective unconscious to awareness, and the harsh treatment Jung's ego receives is reflective of just how far modern civilization has strayed from its instinctual roots. A universal spiritual will emerges within him, reminding Jung of the importance of his finite personality, the impotence of his finite personality. Steiner, for his part, suggests that learning to identify with this universal will, rather than remaining in an egoic relationship to it through emotions of reverence or disgust, allows the human soul to build a bridge into the spiritual world, such that true inspiration from spiritual beings becomes possible. As a rule, says Steiner, spiritual events are much closer to emotions than to conceptions. In terms of Jung's psychology, the thinking function is unable to reconcile itself with the powerful emotionality of the unconscious. The individual human being must include other modalities of consciousness to make sense of the feeling tone images that erupt from its depths. The practice of active imagination makes it possible for the alienated ego to develop an awareness of and renewed participation in the mythic archetypes binding it together with the collective psyche of the human species. Jung's method directs attention to the symbolic visualization of luminous emotions, which may indeed be heralding the presence of higher worlds. Pregnant with the universal self. Jung offers the modern individual a new path of initiation with no outward cult or ritual. It is a path of solitude and inner development, though its effects reach far beyond the individual soul. successful initiates pass through the threshold of the ordinary world, and in Steiner's terms, arrive among the beings who bring about spiritual events. To draw to a close here, I quote Gebser, who writes, previously, the spiritual was realizable only approximately in the emotional darkness of the magical, in the twilight of imagination in the mythical, and in the brightness of abstraction in the mental. The mode of realization now manifesting itself ensures that it is also perceptible concretely as it begins to coalesce with our consciousness. As Jung, Gebser, and Steiner have helped make clear, I hope, the evolution of consciousness has both individual and collective elements, with the transformation of the latter effective through the transformation of the former. As Jung put it, the service of the self is divine service and the service of mankind. If I carry myself, I relieve mankind of myself and heal myself from the God. So that's all I have. Let me X out of this, stop sharing my screen, and I hope we can engage in a conversation for a few minutes.
Okay, before we take questions, there's a security person ticketing people who are parked on the dirt out here. So if you have a blue car or if you're parked on the dirt, you might want to go out there right now. Okay.
Hey, Matt. Oops, where is he? Oh. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Sean. Good to see you.
Oh,
Wish I could have seen your talk this morning.
great paper. I'm wondering if you can say a few words about. Oh, sorry, Matt. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I can.
I'm wondering if you can. I'm wondering if you can say a few words about how the incarnation of the self. By the way, I loved your complex whole version of the incarnation of the self, which, as you know, is how I've been characterizing it as well. How Jung's idea of the self and Gebser's integral and diaphanous origin and so on, how we can bring it, make it a bit more real relative to the real unus mundus, or one world in which we're embedded, which is this world, which is on the edge. Like affirming everything you said about the need for the transformation of individual consciousness and so on. How do you relate that shift of individual consciousness to the on the ground, literally, fact and in the air situation that we're all involved in right now?
It's a great question, Sean. I think humanity needs can only originate in individuals doing work on themselves. And on the other hand, because of certain inequities in socioeconomic inequities, not everyone is granted the same privilege to practice active imagination or to cultivate one's psyche so as to become more individuated. So it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. I mean, do we need to change these political structures and economic structures first, or do we just need to do the best we can? Those people who are able to transform themselves as individuals. It's a really difficult question. I think, I'm a strong believer that every human being has a right to engage in education in the deepest sense, which is a kind of cultivation not only of one's mind, but of one's soul and one's body. And I think the best way I can conceive of to bring together both sides of this equation, individual cultivation and collective transformation, is to really emphasize the importance of education, and making sure that all children have access to an educational process where they're cared for as individuals, where they're allowed to develop into their full capacity as human beings. When we talk about the incarnation of the self, in Jung's terms, the emergence of the integral structure of consciousness in Gebser's terms, I think we're just talking about the flowering of our full humanity and what it means to be human. And somehow all of these layers of what we are and who we are need to become transparent to one another. And when I say that education seems to be the crucial meeting place of individual and collective transformation, I don't just mean education of the mind, right? I think there's a way in which we can engage a learning process and a developmental, a cultivation, a formation process at each of these levels, magic, mythic, and mental. It would be interesting to go into what education looks like at each of those levels. How do we cultivate our capacity for magical consciousness, for mythic consciousness? I think active imagination is an example of a tool for cultivating mythic or mythic consciousness. Mental consciousness is cultivated by what we normally think of as education, reading books and writing and so on. But yeah, I think the most concrete example I can give of how to bring about this transformation would be by valuing education and pushing for access to quality education for as many people as possible. I think that's 1 minute left.
Hello, Matt.
Hello.
This is Daniel.
Oh, hey, Daniel. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So, quick question. You brought out a little bit certain limitations of on Jung's part with respect to the potential of him reducing authentic spirituality to psychic projections, even though you then did talk very at great length about Jung because, of course, the spiritual is in him as well. But I wondered on the flip side if you have any thoughts about the opposite issue, that is, if one takes a kind of spiritual orientation a la Steiner or anthroposophy or even a certain Gebserian notion of immediate realization, which isn't Gebserian, but just the other side of that potential issue of a spiritual path that doesn't recognize the unconscious sufficiently and the soul work necessary?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the difficult tasks anyone who does this active imagination work is faced with is distinguishing between personal material that's related to a personal unconscious and material that's truly collective. I don't think there's a sharp boundary between these, but one of the risks involved with what's called spiritual bypassing is that we don't do a thorough job of the shadow work that's necessary to understand our own personal unconscious, to come to grips with our own personal wounds, because if we become spiritually inflated and think that maybe we really have tapped into something collective or even transpersonal, and we want to be the mouthpiece for that in the world, but if we haven't healed our own personal wounds, it's going to distort that message, and we're likely to wield the power that comes from a certain spiritual realization in a less than integrated harm to the communities that we're engaging with. So it's very important not to rush to the spiritual and think that the psychological work, the shadow work that remains to be done, that it can simply be put to the side. And I don't know. I'm not saying that certainly not saying that Steiner or Gebser did that. I don't know, but when we engage with their work, it's important to not think that there's sort of a highway to spiritual realities that allows us to just bypass the importance of our own personal psychological work. All right, I see the stop sign. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you.